numbers do look like they've stabilised a little bit. So we'll get things going. So firstly, thanks all for attending. Looks like we've got a good number of people across industry participants to this session. So that's great to see. So thank you all. What we plan to do today is to go through the proposed plan and the update to the proposed plan as a result of the ongoing scenario planning that we've been undertaking. To remind, this is off the back of some slower than expected SIT testing progress, and then we've been looking at what that means for the timeline for the last few months. And so this is really the proposed output of that exercise that will form the basis of the change request that we'll be issuing out to you for impact assessment in about a week and a half's time. In terms of the agenda for today, then, so obviously we're doing the welcome and introduction, which is led by myself. We'll go through the approach to building the plan, so a bit of context as to what we've done to get to this point today. We'll then take you through the proposed critical path to M10 and some of the knock-on implications that has for downstream milestones. And then we'll touch on next steps and the change request and Q&A as well. I'd say that throughout, feel free to ask questions either by raising your hand or through Slido. If we could just skip on to the next slide. You'll see the QR code there in the top right of the corner. If you scan, it'll take you through to the Slido page. The code for that is the hashtag and then MHHS. Or you can go via slido.com or the app if you have the Slido app. So yeah, as we go through, if you are comfortable and would like to ask a question throughout, please put your hand up and we'll get to it. Otherwise, if you'd rather submit via Slido, we will we'll go through all of those questions too. What we'll aim to do is we'll take intermittent pauses through the presentation and check Slido and pick up those questions as they come in. Any that we don't, we'll then pick up at the end as well. So hopefully we've got enough time. We've got through till 1 o'clock to cover everything. So I don't intend to talk for the next 85 minutes, but so hopefully there's enough time for both conversation and presentation. Okay, if we can just move on to the next slide then. So before I jump into it, I was just going to hand over to Keith Clark to see if there are any opening remarks or anything he would like to say in terms of setting the scene. Otherwise, we'll jump straight in.
Yeah, Lewis, thank you. I'm not really very much, but only to say that obviously what we said was that ahead of a CR and an impact assessment, we would give line of sight on what we're intending to do. And in terms of everything that we are proposing at the moment, in terms of the plan, nothing is endorsed by Ofgem at this stage. It is an overall plan that we've built, and we've done that in alignment with a number of stakeholders. So we feel that what we're putting together is realistic and achievable and also recognisable by industry participants as something that would be such. And obviously we want to give as much information as early as possible to provide you with an ability to prepare in advance for the CR. And I'm sure that Lewis will cover this more, but we've done a lot of work and we've engaged with a lot of stakeholders to try to ensure that what we come up with will be a plan that we build with industry and deliver with industry. And it's always been our commitment not to do it to industry, but to do it with industry. And therefore, it's important that we come up with a plan that is realistic, achievable, and can be supported by industry participants so that we continue to work together to deliver it successfully. I'll just say that at this point. And obviously the process by which we build something and then take it back through the right governance process through PSG and ultimately to an Ofgem decision on a PSG approval is something that's a very important activity at this point. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Lewis.
Great, thanks, Keith. Okay, so firstly, we'll take you through the proposed approach to recalibrating the plan. So what we've kind of been doing really over the last 2 months or so. So if we just move on to the next slide. So this all really started at the end of cycle one. When cycle one of SIT functional closed, it was clear that we needed to do something differently going into cycle two to improve testing velocity and achieve those cycle two targets, both from a throughput perspective, but also other design coverage and stability targets. We had a testing retrospective in between the end of cycle one and start of cycle two, that many of you will have been involved in, to capture feedback, understand some of the challenges faced in cycle one, and also what could be done differently in cycle two. And we implemented some of these initial actions, and we've been tracking those weekly through FTIG, and they were implemented with some success. We continue to monitor progress through the first two sprints of cycle two. And whilst there was a marginal uptick in velocity of testing, it wasn't significant enough. And we knew that now we were starting to carry a level of risk as a program that needed to be assessed. This was the trigger for us to then initiate the scenario planning work. So we started doing this after sprint two. And what we looked at initially were three key scenarios. So the first one was holding M10. So if there was a delay to testing, what could we do to maintain the M10 date, which was the 7th of March next year? Scenario two then used the current throughput rates that we'd had and seen, and assumed a level of improvement in velocity based on system stability, fixing of defects, and followed that hockey stick trajectory. And then scenario three assumed that there was no ability for testing to get any quicker, and it was almost a linear view of progress and a linear level of testing that could be achieved. Fundamentally, what we were able to do here is identify that scenario one and holding M10 was unviable, because it became very apparent very quickly that using any contingency in the plan effectively meant that one bad sprint or one significant defect would effectively see the M10 date slip anyway. So straight away we identified that wasn't a viable option. And then scenario three, in terms of there being no throughput, we could see that there was an increase in testing velocity, and we'd spoken with participants who were involved in SIT testing to understand whether they felt like they could get quicker and what they could do to increase the pace. And therefore, from that perspective, we were confident that the kind of the hockey stick or S-curve analogy that applies, where testing will get quicker over time, does still ring true. So we were able to discount scenario one and scenario three and focus in on scenario two, which was using existing data that we had, assuming a certain level of improvement in velocity, but noting that would mean a likely delay to M10. It was just then about assessing what the delay would be going forward. So if we just move on to the next slide. This is a bit of a four-step approach, which articulates some of what I've just said. So I'll try not to labour the point. What I've just articulated on the previous slide probably covers the first chevron you're seeing here. Once we identified scenario two as the key logical scenario to follow, we identified a long list of open items, which we've called the planning focal points, which many of you have fed back on to date. And these were key points that we identified would help refine the scenario. We obviously use sprint 2 data from cycle 2 at that time. So what we were able to do is look at sprints 3 and 4 data as well to refine any execution modeling that we were progressing. And then we also begun to develop the plan for a plan. So how would we refine the model, engage industry, and get to a point where we were then able to go out to yourselves for consultation and impact assessment on the subsequent change request. We presented these to PSG and FTIG to get endorsement and buy-in for that direction of travel as well. We also asked each cohort in SIT to undertake their own modelling exercise to support ours as well. So we set them the task of the number of points that they needed to attain, And then therefore how fast do they think they could get? What are the key assumptions and constraints that would then underpin that? And this was all about capturing more data and more information to help build our own model, so we weren't doing it in isolation. And we started engaging with central parties and code bodies at the same time, noting some of the implications that would have on themselves as well. And that brings us to kind of where we are today in terms of defining the plan, closing out those open items, engaging wider with central parties, code bodies, program participants, also focused engagement with the IPA and with Ofgem, which we've been doing over the last month or so, and then leading up to this point, which is of course the dialogue session. And then in terms of the next steps, would be to obviously finalise the change request, get that approved at Change Board, which is currently scheduled for next week. We'll have the pre-CR webinar that normally takes place as part of the change control process, and then we'd issue the change request out for impact assessment, which is currently scheduled to go out on the 23rd of September. And then it's about assessing all of the inputs that come back from yourselves, presenting those findings and a recommendation to PSG, and then fundamentally, because we are and then fundamentally we'll be taking Ofgem through that recommendation and getting their approval as well. If we just move on. So I guess one of the key things we wanted to just talk about is how we've kind of gathered evidence to underpin a realistic test model. And again, I don't want to go over perhaps what I've talked about, but that's kind of what we set out on this slide. So we did, as I said, continue to refine and review the modelling that we had. What we wanted to avoid against as a programme was being overly optimistic in our modelling approach. And we felt that we were at risk of doing that if we sat and did the modelling, studying the data that we had, which we didn't feel like we necessarily had enough of, but doing that kind of in isolation. And that was one of the key reasons why we went out to the SIT cohorts to ask them to undertake their own execution modelling exercise. And then we sat down with the MVC to go through those models and ask, what the programme could do, what they felt they could do, and how believable and achievable they were, how aggressive, conservative, for example, each of those models were. And that helped give us a good understanding of the variation of where the cohorts were and what the art of the possible was. And again, that gave us the data points needed that we could feed into our modelling to fundamentally protect against our own optimism bias, ensure that there's a level of industry input in any outputs that we shared down the line as well. Brilliant. So building the plan. If we just move on then to the next slide. So what we've done here, and there's a lot of words on here, so I won't talk through all of it verbatim, but at PSG, so what we presented back at FTIG for the last few weeks is a view of the key focal points that have made up the programme plan, some of those key activities and decisions that would drive the critical path and the timeline that need to be bottomed out and defined. We presented those back to PSG last week and set the PSG reps the task of taking those back to their constituents and feeding back on any of the key points and the general direction of travel that the programme was moving in. So thank you to all of you who have fed into that process. It's been really helpful, and that feedback has come through to us. We are going through it with a fine-tooth comb, but what we've tried to do is bring that up, and some of those initial findings, capture them on this slide. Generally, I think the feedback has been positive in the sense that the participants, you're all supportive of these are the right focal points to focus on, which has been good. And there's a few further actions for us to pick up on, which I'll just talk to. So the first is we recognise that the feedback that's come back, that we need to provide further clarification on the rationalised tests that we've talked about and what the knock-on implications are for qualification. So that's something that we will take away. there were a number of questions on the scope of regression testing. So at the moment, the assumption is that 7 weeks, which is in the current plan, will remain the SIT regression window. But there are a number of questions around what the scope of regression is and when that will be defined. So that is something that we'll take away, and that will be built into the plan, and we will define that. Something else that came up was the knock-on implications downstream of some future industry releases. So there is I think a REC industry release planned for June 25, which would have of course been after the current planned M10 date, but without giving the game away, so to speak, it would now be that release would now be planned for now before the M10 date. So what do we need to do there? Does that need to move back in line with the M10 date? So that's something else that we need to work through with our code body colleagues. And there's some other questions around. I know that's been ongoing at TORIG around the M16 transition to the new settlement timetable, which won't necessarily form part of this scope of this, but needs to be bottomed out and will obviously have implications on the plan. And then the other bit of feedback we had was around the M10 M11 timeline. So as you'll know, in the program plan currently, there's a 4-week window between M10 and M11. That was somewhat of a hangover from the original off-gem transition timetable. And so we challenged ourselves to see if that gap could be closed. And while we felt that there were options to do so, because a lot of the preparatory activity needs to be done for M10 rather than M11, actually we do think it has wider implications downstream in terms of constraining gaps between the end of qualification and the start and the end of migration. So the proposal as it stands is that we'll retain the 4-week window between M10 and M11. But it was something really that we really wanted to explore and make sure that we that we tested the viability of. If we just move on to the next slide, then. Great. So in terms of this slide, then, so it's just around some additional improvements that we've made to the plan, and you'll see when we get to that. But we've delayed the start of SIT non-functional beyond to after Christmas. So this allows for program participants to focus on SIT functional, on SIT migration, as well as giving more time to SIT settlement testing. By giving more time to SIT settlement testing, we've retained as much of the scope as possible in SIT B, the SIT B environment. For those in FTIG, that you know there was a proposal to potentially use SIT A for settlement testing, but by doing what we're proposing to do, we will keep the bulk of the testing in SIT B, so it minimises any disruption there. And then we're proposing a delay to the start of non-SIT LDSO testing and to beyond Christmas. So this helps provide greater stability, means we can hit those firm targets set as part of the cycle 2 criteria as well. And what we've done as well is we've extended the data preparation windows in the plan from what were originally 10 days to 15. So this just helps reflect lessons learned from the data retrospective that we held, giving more time to those data loading activities and ensuring that we get those right to enable testing to move at the pace we needed to move at. So those are some changes and some plan improvements that we've put in place today that you'll see when we get to the plan shortly. Next slide then, please, if that's okay. Great. And so here are some plan improvements that we're proposing to put in place to help de-risk delivery. So I've already touched on the top one, which is the data loading window and increasing that to 15 days. We're proposing for a further delay to the start of SIT operational to ensure that we've got all of the information that we need there in terms of the service management designs, the scenarios and the test scripts are all set out. We're proposing to run SIT non-functional, SIT operational as a collective cohort rather than having a kind of an MVC and non-MVC approach like we do with SIT functional. So again, that kind of focuses on taking all of the SIP participants through testing at one time, and ideally then gives the SIP B environment back sooner than it would do if we needed to keep it around for the non-MVC to complete testing, which hopefully again saves some, whilst it creates a little bit of contingency in the plan, it hopefully saves some costs as well. And then we split out the themes for SIT operational and SIT non-functional as well, and accurately map the dependencies between the two to look at how we can deliver the testing safely, and ensure that the kind of delays that we've made here don't have implications for the critical path. I'll just pause and just see if Annabelle or Hannah, if there are any questions that have come through on the Slido, or if anyone has any comments or questions for the moment before I jump on.
We have got one question from Joe on Slido. So you said that all cohorts did the modelling for timelines, but then also said that you engaged the MVC. Did all cohorts engage in this process, or was it just the MVC?
So we asked all cohorts, so all 8 cohorts, to submit models and assumptions. We had detailed sessions and sat down with the MVC cohorts.
That's the only one that's come through on Slido.
Right. Okay, I will. Well, let's press on then. So we just thought a helpful reminder would be of the current baseline plan. So if we just move on to the next slide, what you'll see here is the CR22 baseline and then the route to M10. So this doesn't include the short-term tactical plan, which we've got on the next slide, but this was what was set at CR22. So you'll see SIP functional and migration finishing on the 3rd of January next year, and then SIT operational and non-functional finishing slightly later, and then that SIT MVC completion date taking place on the 7th of the 2nd, and then M10 effectively taking place on the 7th of March, so about 4 to 5 weeks later. Non-SIT LDSO testing scheduled to start at the start of October, supplier and agent kicking off at the beginning of February. I won't dwell on this too much. It was just a reminder, and we will share all of these slides as well afterwards. So it was also, when you look at the proposed plan that will go in CR55, you can hopefully quite easily cross-compare that and see the differences. If we just move to the next slide then. So you'll have all seen this. This was a view of the timeline and the critical path up to the end of the year. We communicated this last month, and this was around when we agreed to extend cycle 2 of SIT functional and SIT migration to enable 2 additional sprints. So that was a 5-week extension and effectively a deferral of the IR8 maintenance window. We also, as part of this exercise, extended the maintenance window to 20 days from the previous 10 days, again to allow for additional data loading activities. It also gave us in SIT B 5 additional weeks for settlement testing that we felt like we needed, so we pushed SIT non-functional back to the other side of the maintenance window, with no change at this point to SIT operational, which was scheduled to start at the early in October. We shifted non-SIT LDSO qualification back as well by 1 month to say that it would start no earlier than the 1st of November. So if we then move on to the plan and probably the key headline that you've all joined the call to wait for. So if we move on to the next slide. This is then the proposed plan that we would include in CR55, and at this stage, as Keith mentioned, it is purely a proposal, and we want to gather feedback on this and ideally endorsement, both today through FTIG and tomorrow through the coming kind of days as well, before we go out to issue this out to impact assessment. And it's effectively the key reason why we called this meeting. The key message and the key headline is that we're proposing a 5-month delay to M10, and therefore an extension of testing in SIT functional and SIT migration by 5 months. So SIT functional and SIT migration would now be scheduled to finish at on the 27th of July, which is 6 months after it was originally scheduled to finish, and that's because we've got an additional month, which I'll touch on shortly, for settlement testing in Sit A as well, that you'll see in that top swim lane in the turquoise or light blue box. We've retained the logic in the plan from when the MVC finishes their testing to when the non-MVC finishes testing. So that was basically an 11-week window after the MVC completes testing to retain the environments for the non-MVC to complete their testing. So that logic remains the same. We didn't feel there was any reason to extend that or bring it back in. We still want to give the non-MVC as much opportunity to complete testing as possible. So the proposal is that with the Sit A environment would remain until the 12th of September for testing to complete. What we've also retained in this plan, and we've stressed this a few times in various meetings, is the underlying logic. We don't want, just because we've delayed M10, what we don't want to do is then constrain downstream activities and create more risk downstream to almost overcompensate. So SIT functional migration finish on the 27th of the 6th. There's then that 2-week gap between the end of SIT execution testing finishing and the SIT MVC completion milestone being approved. So that gives us time to finalise all of the qualification materials. It gives us time to finalise the exit report as well, which is a key input into that exercise. So that SIT MVC complete milestone is now scheduled for the 11th of July. Originally, that was the 7th of February. So that's now the 11th of July. And then from there, again, the same logic and milestones and sequencing follows that is in the current plan. So it's around about a four week duration of activities that cover the final qualification activities, prep and cutover activities, and then service activation to get to an M10 date, which is now scheduled at the 13th of August. As I mentioned, we've retained the M10 M11 gap, or proposing to retain that gap, and so that's then a further 4 weeks on. So you've got the M11 date taking place on the start of migration, effectively starting on the 10th of September. Now we recognise obviously the M10 date is in August. That is peak holiday season, but you know our view is that we are a year away, and the level of risk associated with M10 is we think manageable to go live in that time, and fundamentally there'll never be a good time to go live. So we feel that in terms of any risk associated with people being on holiday and things like that, there is sufficient time to make those arrangements now, and it's something that we're comfortable with as a leadership team in this proposal. Just some other key changes then that are in the plan. So I'll start with the Sit A environment. So we've added an additional sprint, which you'll see boxed in the red dotted box for the gap analysis tests. So the work with the RTTM and review with the qualification team identified a series of tests that needed to be created and included in the SIT functional migration scope. That's around about 19 tests. And so that gap analysis sprint has been added in, so an additional 2-week sprint to cover those tests. We've extended the maintenance window for regression to 15 days from an initial 10 days. You'll see that this is a yellow box because it is purely a data load. What we are assuming is that there'll be no additional major release of functionality, so no interim release 9. And any defect fixes will be fixed throughout the cycle. And so that data, that window will be a data loading window to enable the COS settlement tests and then regression testing to take place. As I mentioned, we've got a small part of the settlement scope taking place in April, immediately after that maintenance window and before regression testing starts. These are, I think it's 8 tests effectively within the settlement testing scope that require the CSS environment. There is only one CSS environment, and that is currently connected to SIT A. So in terms of, we did explore whether it was feasible to move that to SIT B, but again, I think the complexities that would create far kind of outweigh any benefit. So we've penciled some time in 2 sprints there to undertake those tests in the SIT-A environment. And then after that, regression testing will commence. And as I mentioned before, that will be a 7-week window as per the original plan. The proposal then in SIT-B is that we'll extend settlement testing through to the end of the year, so giving really as much time as possible in the plan to get settlement testing done, recognising that the progress made to date has been slow, and we absolutely need more time to be allocated to settlement testing. There is a certain level of risk there associated, in the sense that testing has been slow in settlement. It has been more complex, I think, than anticipated, and so I'm sure the question in many of your heads is that enough time? We think it is. Like we've tested this timeline with a few participants. We think it is, and we would strive and endeavour to get settlement testing done by the end of December. So to go into the new year with non-functional operational, then able to commence. So then, as I mentioned, we shifted non-functional operational to the new year. These changes don't impact the critical path, as you can see by the red line on this screen. What we'd propose is we'd start with theme 1 of non-functional early in January. That's effectively the Helix and Avanade volume testing. In parallel, we can do the data loading activities for SIT non-functional and SIT operational, but these would be the program participant data loading. We'd have to do the Helix and Avanade data loading after we've completed theme 1, which is that kind of 5-day period highlighted in the red box you'll see there. That will then enable SIT operational to start. At the moment, we've penciled in for the 10th of February, running for around about three months. We've got some preparation activity for program participants to get ready for themes 2 and themes 3 of non-functional, which runs from February through to the end of March. And then on the 31st of March, for roughly about 2 months, we've then got the non-functional testing for themes 2 and themes 3. You'll notice that against SIT, there's two chevrons here for SIT operational. SIT operational themes 1, 2, 3, and that's batch 2 of theme 3 require the SIT-B environment. SIT operational theme 3 batch 1, which is the service management components, does not require the SIT-B environment. So there's some flexibility around when that starts. The intention at the moment, as per the plan, is for that to start in early January and be the first part of SIT operational testing that we can do. But there is a TBD against that, as we're just awaiting the timelines from the Elexon team to confirm when that testing will take place. So there is that risk in the plan at the moment that is a TBD. We will have that those dates bottomed out by the time the CR goes out on the 23rd of September. So that will have some dates attached to it. There is a direct dependency in the current plan, and that exists today between SIT functional finishing and supplier and agent qualification testing starting. So to enable us to have the best possible functional basis of which to test from. So SIT supplier and agent qualification testing does shift as a result of this plan, of course, and supplier and agent qualification testing would then start on the 14th of the 7th to the 14th of July, and that would still run for the same duration as previously. So the testing window would be 12 months, and then obviously there's the 2 months after for the qualification activities, depending on which wave of qualification testing participants are in. And then the sandbox activities will shift in accordance with that as well, and in parallel. With non-SIT LDSO, then, as I mentioned, we've delayed that now to the start of the new year. We've actually been able to give non-SIT LDSO qualification testing more time. Previously, I think it was a 3-month window. It's now, now just over 5 months. So there's more time allocated to non-SIT LDSO qualification testing, and also that means it's not on the critical path as well. So there's actually more time between when that testing finishes and when kind of the QAD sign-off is required. So again, it actually de-risks the any concern that non-set LDSO would come onto the critical path, which we did have in the current plan. And then finally, just to reiterate, the M10 M11 gap remains the same. SIT operation, sorry, SIT function, SIT migration, as you can see here, really do drive the critical path. In the previous plan, SIT operational was the last test phase to finish. In this plan, it is now SIT functional and SIT migration. If there is an opportunity to complete testing those test phases sooner, then we will endeavour to do so and bring the timeline forwards to do so. So that is why on this plan you'll see between July and August there is a kind of a translucent blue box or a window, if you like, because if participants or the MVC has completed testing before that date of the 27th of July, what we wouldn't do is then wait 27th of June. What we wouldn't do is wait until the 27th of June to then kick off the rest of the kind of qualification activities. So if there is an opportunity that for that testing to have been completed sooner, we will look to go sooner, and that will bring the latter part of that timeline forwards. Obviously, there are implications and considerations around that need to be assessed and reviewed if that were to occur. As it stands, we're planning for M10 being on the 13th of the 8th. But again, it's just to say that if people can go faster, we'll do everything as a programme to enable that. I think those were probably the key points I wanted to make on this slide, and I suspect this will be the bulk of where the questions may lie. And there's a lot of information there, so you may not have questions immediately. You may want to take it away and digest. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, quite a lot of questions have come through on Slido. So
should we just? Sorry, Annabelle, I can see Lee's popped his hand up. So should we start with just any questions in the room and then go to Slido? Yep, Lee.
Just this box on the bottom right around supply and agent quality, is that non-SIT parties starting in July?
Correct. Yes. Yeah, that's the start of qualification testing for those non-SIT participants.
So that would be pre-M11 now, is what you're suggesting? Just so I'm clear. It is, isn't it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it was pre-M11 in the previous plan. So I think it was scheduled to kick off at the beginning of February in the previous plan, and M11 would have been in April. So the underlying logic and spacing between activities there hasn't changed at all. It's just the dates have moved.
Right. Okay.
Linda, I think you're next.
On regression testing, you've not put you've not defined the scope. You said you don't know what the scope is, but you've put 7 weeks in for it. Do you feel there could be? It seems to be time boxed, so I'm just concerned about whether that's long enough, given we don't quite know what the gap's going to be at the end of cycle 3. So, what's your approach been in terms of that, and why have you taken the approach you've taken?
So the underlying assumption at the moment is that 7 weeks is sufficient. We have been identifying candidate tests to feed into regression again. So whilst we haven't formalised that scope, we do have a set of candidate tests that have been able to feed into that analysis. There's a certain level of risk there, and we do need to agree, and we've been talking about this as a team, we do need to agree what the scope of regression is to ensure that the 7 weeks is sufficient and make that work. So we have been monitoring it, we have been assessing it, but we haven't yet finalised what that scope is, but we do have a set of kind of regression candidate tests. I will just see if any of my testing colleagues are on the call and would want to add to any of that. So I don't know if Roger or Dom are on and would want to say anything else.
Yeah, so we acknowledge there's a bit more work to do there to identify those candidate tests. We will also have to take a risk-based approach based on the releases that we've had throughout cycle 1, 2, and 3, and the test coverage that we've had on those releases. There will be a component of the regression testing which is there to actually regression test the central parties, and so we'll spread that across the cohorts. And then we'll also need to identify on a market role basis what we need you to cover. So we acknowledge we need to gain a bit more maturity in that space. But we do think that it will be fixed to that 7-week period. But if we, obviously when we do more analysis, we realise that may need to be increased, we'll obviously report back to you. But at the moment, our confidence is high that we can meet that 7 weeks in the plan.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to supplement that, we'll be taking that risk-based approach. We'll also look at high priority tests to make sure that high impact and or high probability risks will be addressed in that as well. Same with any tests that maybe we pass with observations the first time around or have manual workarounds. We'll just make sure that those tests are working.
Great, thanks, Roger. Richard, I think you're up next.
Thanks, Liz. I think you may have already just touched on this, but just looking at the quad sign-off deadline, should we assume that initial quad will be circa 2 months before that?
Yeah, I think there's an assumption there that some of those timelines will shift in line with this plan, and I appreciate they're not necessarily articulated on here because we focused on the critical path that's been driven by testing. Those dates will be updated and will be available in the detail plan that we issue out with the impact assessment. So yeah, we need to work through the intricacies of the lower level milestones and activities with our qualification colleagues, which we'll be doing over the course of the next few days. So all of that information will be in the plan when it goes out. So yeah, I think that's a safe assumption to make.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Les.
Lee, I think you're up again, unless that's a legacy hand.
That's a new one. Thanks, Lewis. Just wondering about impacts beyond M11, so M14. At the moment, I'm assuming they're remaining as they are, given what.
Yeah. So we've got a slide next which will articulate those dates. But yes, with M11, with supply and agent moving, and obviously the attachment that has then on M14 will move as well. What we really want to emphasize is that we're not trying to constrain any timelines or bring any timelines back in. So the same duration that the supplier and agents had for qualification in the current baseline is what you will have in this baseline. The only thing that's changing is just the dates.
Yeah, no, I get that. I've got to say, I was more thinking migration than those things, because I think what you've got here kind of alludes to things like qualification having an extension, but I'm more thinking about impacts on your migration window.
Yeah, so I mean, the migration window remains as 18 months. That was one of the reasons why we've decided to keep M11 where it is in terms of the spacing, because we did consider whether M11 and M10 could take place concurrently, but that would of course bring M15 forwards, which would leave less time between M14 and M15. So any of those kind of later qualification parties would have less time to migrate their MPANs. So that was one of the contributing factors as to why we've actually said we'll leave the spacing between M10 and M11 where it is, to ensure that again no downstream activities and windows are constrained. So there'll be the same 18-month window and the same spacing between milestones that is in the current plan in the proposal here.
Okay, thanks for that, Lewis.
Sophie, I think you're next.
So apologies, this might be addressed at the MWG later on this afternoon, but I suppose my query kind of relates to what this means for documentation that's currently being progressed by participants to support their migration submissions. So naturally, with this change, it will probably impact a lot of the content that might be in the progress being populated.
Yeah.
Are participants going to be given additional time now to complete a replan of those documents in readiness for submission? And also, just to clarify, I'm assuming this delay to migration start isn't going to impact the overall migration timeline in terms of the time available. So is it going to also be noted around what that means for the migration completion window? So sorry, It's a bit of a two-part question there, but same.
The migration completion window, I can assure you, will remain as 18 months. So there's no constraining of that.
Okay.
That window will remain the same. The timelines will just move.
Yeah.
In terms of the first question, yeah, I appreciate, and this, it applies to migration, but I think also a lot of the pit evidence that many of you will be working through. You know, we need to work through the detailed changes, and all of those detailed changes will be captured in the detailed program plan that goes out with the CR. So I think, you know, there's an assumption there that you will be given more time to respond to those activities, because kind of responding to it now doesn't make a whole great deal of sense, given that you're then going to have to effectively sit on those submissions for longer. So it's a safe assumption, I think, to make that you will be given more time for those preparatory activities that you're working on at the moment. I appreciate that you've done a lot of work up front, and that might be slightly frustrating, because you might need to there'll be a level of rework there. So we recognise that, but we'll aim to give more time to those prep activities.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's fine. That makes sense. Thank you.
Matt.
Recognise that we shouldn't do any replanning until the CR's approved, right? But that's a process that could take a couple of months, while some of us are in pit and would expect to have exited pit before this necessarily gets signed off.
So what we'll need to do
what should we assume for the interim period?
Yeah, so I think what we'll need to do is, based on the feedback from the impact assessment, we have the short-term tactical plan takes us up to the end of the year. But based on the feedback from the assessment, and if there is endorsement into this plan, or you know, whatever the endorsement or recommendation is that goes to PSG, is that we would need to agree the interim position until we get a final Ofgem position. I think the key thing, as I mentioned at the start, is that the current M10 date and trying to hold that isn't viable. So, you know, working to that plan doesn't make a great deal of sense either, because it you know, we're not working to that essentially today, because it hasn't been, you know, because we're not achieving those timelines. So, you know, we'll need to agree the interim position. The assumption is that this would then, whatever is proposed and proposed to Ofgem by PSG, would become the interim position until Ofgem can tell us otherwise.
I guess from a participant perspective, it's difficult to know now whether we should carry on as is, or whether we should assume a delay.
Well, I think once you get the detailed plan in effectively a week or so's time, you know, that should help with some of your thinking. I do appreciate that there's a level of ambiguity wrapped around that isn't helpful for all of us, which is why we want to get to a decision on the plan and on the new baseline as soon as possible. So I do appreciate it's an imperfect situation to be in, but I think once you've got that plan, hopefully that allows you to look at and reflect on some of the proposed dates in there. And again, provided the general feedback is that what we're proposing here seems reasonable, sensible, and can be endorsed by all of yourselves as the new baseline. I think that it's safe that you could work towards that as the interim position until Ofgem approve it.
So, I'll stop now. Sorry, carry on. Makes sense.
Anik, I think you're up next.
Hello, hi Lewis. I don't know if this is explicitly called out yet, so apologies if you've already answered it. But obviously, on the qualification area, we're talking about MVC. But am I right to assume there'll also be an impact on the participants allocated in the waves? Would there be a change in their dates? The
non-sit or the non-MVC participants.
Yeah.
Which one? Sorry, just to clarify.
Like just the way. Will there be an impact? Can we assume there'll be an impact on the wave qualification dates?
So the wave qualification dates will move out. Yes, absolutely, because they'll need to enable the waves or the supplier and agent qualification testing to start. SIT functional needs to finish. So the first wave would start on the 14th of July as articulated in this plan. In terms of the qualification activities as well associated with that for non-SIT participants, that those obviously would move too, because obviously the qualification testing is an input into the final QAD process. So yes, all of those waves, so waves 1 to 4 will move alongside as per the kind of plan on here. So yes, they will move. But what we, again, just to stress, is what we're not aiming to do is constrain the window. So it will still be that kind of 12-month window for testing. And then I think in the current plan, there's a 2-month window after each wave to effectively do their qualification process. So that logic still remains.
So what you're saying is spacing's the same as they currently are on the plan in terms of like initial to final QADs,
Yeah.
but we're estimating that they'll be moved in line with the duration that you've outlined for SIT MVC qual.
Yes. So if you see at the bottom swim lane, you'll see the supplier and agent qualification testing chevron, which is the blue one, and you've got the dependency running from SIT functional through to that. So there's a dependency there and a 2-week gap between the two in the current plan. That dependency in the gap remains the same. Obviously, what has changed is the supplier and agent now goes from starting on the 3rd of February and running for 12 months to the 14th of July and running for 12 months.
Okay, thanks, Lewis.
No problem. Caroline, I think you're up next.
Hi, Lewis. Thank you for this update. Wanted to find out P434, the mandate for UMS, the deadline is aligned with M11. So does that mean that will be moving as well to reflect the new changes in the plan, subject to this being accepted, of course?
That's a great question and probably one that I am less familiar with. But if it is aligned to M11, then the assumption, yes, we'll take it away and check. But the assumption would be that would move with M11 too.
So I proposed it. So that and P432, which pinned to M14, were milestone driven. So yes, they do.
Yeah. So any underlying logic that exists like that in the current plan, we would retain. So yes, it's a really good consideration, and we'll make sure we capture that as a clear assumption and call it out. But yes, that would move. Those two examples would move with the associated milestones.
Cool. Thanks for the update.
Shazzy, I think you're next.
Just coming off. My Wi-Fi is not great. It's quite noisy here. A couple of questions actually, Lewis. Thanks. So have you socialised this view with Ofgem already and had any feedback, what has the feedback been? Yes,
so we took Ofgem through this yesterday and all of our approach, which is what enabled us to have this session, because obviously if Ofgem had kind of reservations or concerns with what we're putting forward, we wouldn't have been able to have gone ahead with today. So we took them through this. Again, just to reiterate what Keith said, they did not endorse the timeline, and any Ofgem endorsement only comes at the end of this process when they actually approve the new baseline. But again, there was some good conversation with them, some considerations. The thing they stressed, I think, is that they want to see in the impact assessment industry buy-in. They want to see evidence. So I think that will put a real emphasis on the thoroughness of the responses in the impact assessment in terms of cost implications, implications on team size, the viability of achieving this. And they did challenge us to see if we could bring some of those later timelines in effectively as a result of the M10 timeline shifting to the right. Again, as I mentioned, we're trying not to constrain timelines, so we're not going to do that. But what that does mean is we'll review all of those activities, but we need to capture as much evidence as possible to be able to demonstrate to Ofgem, why if M10 shifts and M11 shifts, that the rest of the plan shifts with it. So in terms of giving anything away of thumbs up, thumbs down, that they didn't really give any view there, but they did give us the permission to share this timeline with yourselves, basically to gather an initial view, feedback, thoughts on the proposal before it goes ahead to impact assessment. But they reserved any endorsement or approval but they will reserve any endorsement or approval or specific feedback like that until they've seen what comes back in the impact assessment and fundamentally what's proposed to them at the end of this process.
Thanks. So just on my second point was regarding the migration submission that's due at the start of October. You might have already covered it, apologies. Will you be issuing revised envelopes for this submission in start of October?
Yeah, so we'll need to take all of those considerations in the plan, and what we'll do is we'll update the timelines in the detailed plan that goes out for review with you all in a week and a bit's time. So yeah, we'll need to consider all of those timelines, and I think, as I mentioned, there's an assumption there that some of those timelines will move back to give more time, given that we're talking about a 5-month delay here.
Thanks.
Lewis, I just wanted to reinforce the point about Ofgem. So Ofgem remain very concerned about the delay, so we shouldn't undercall the perspective that they have on this one. So based on the conversation, they are very concerned about the proposed delay. But on the other hand, as Lewis said, they want to see that there's industry buy-in for anything that is proposed and recommended to them. And coming back to the point that the plan has to be realistic and achievable, which is why, based on all the work we've done, we've put this in front of you today. So it's a difficult situation, but I don't want it to be thought of as Ofgem's concerns are reduced by any conversations we had yesterday. They are holding their counsel on this point, but they do want the process to be fair, reasonable, and properly conducted through industry. I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Thanks, Keith. I think that's it in terms of hands up in the meeting. Is there anything else on Slido, Annabelle, that we might have that we haven't covered off yet?
Yeah, I'll just go through Slido in a minute, but there's also some on the meeting chat as well. So I think we've covered this off, but can we assume the pit exit and QT entry criteria dates move in line with the QT start date?
Yeah, so we'll confirm all of those timelines in the programme plan. But yeah, I think there's again a safe assumption that those timelines will shift to the right as well, to enable more time for those pit activities to complete.
Cool. And question from Jenny: how does this impact the final implementation date?
Again, the assumption in the detailed plan is that the timelines will all shift in accordance with the timeline, this critical path timeline here. So M11 is obviously tied to M15. So if M11 is shifting by 5 months, M15 will shift by 5 months. M16 is then scheduled 2 months after M15, so that would move again 2 months 2 months after M15. So at the moment, the assumption is the downstream logic all remains the same. The timelines and windows all remain the same. So everything would shift to effectively to the right by 5 months.
Okay, thanks, Lewis. And then just moving to Slido, I'll go through in chronological order. So starting with a question from Anoop: what is the advantage in mixing up all the cohorts for SIT operational and SIT non-functional, and how the orchestration will be planned?
So the SIT non-functional operational team are working through. I think it's more with the nature of the testing, is that they plan to choreograph and take all cohorts through at the same time, which is why the kind of staggering of SIT functional and SIT non and the way SIT functional SIT migration is staggered is slightly different to the way SIT operational and SIT non-functional would be run. I think there's also the scope of those test phases are significantly less in terms of number of test cases than they are in SIT functional and SIT migration. So part of that, I think, is the nature of the testing and also the volume of testing that is needed, and that's kind of why that MVC non-MVC split isn't as apparent in non-functional and operational. I suspect there will be an element of cohorts going away and doing their testing, rather than it being so choreographed that everyone does it together. There will be a certain level of autonomy within those windows for some of the themes, but generally, it's the view is that it can be managed in a smaller scale and all be done kind of at the same time.
Thank you.
Again, I'll just pause there in case I've said anything that Roger or Dom or anyone would want to tell me off for.
No, I think that captured it. Especially with NFT, there's going to be quite a high level of choreography, and we want to make sure that we're running the right tests at the right time. But they all should go fairly quickly.
Great, thanks, Roger. I think I've just seen a note from Warren as well about the migration submissions, which I think the plan would be to keep them to the same timeline. Warren, are you on the call? Do you want to just reiterate that, because that might be against what I articulated?
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. So right now it's best if you all work to the current program plan, and then when the CR is approved and timelines are agreed and confirmed, then we'll obviously adjust envelopes, etc. accordingly. It's just way more easier to do that. And also, as a part of this exercise, we're actually validating that the framework and envelope approach works. So it's more than just a schedule. It's ensuring everything is hanging together.
Thanks, Warren. Apologies if I caused any confusion there. What we will ensure is that is all clear in the detailed plan that goes out. I appreciate there's only so much detail we can get on this slide. So when we send the detailed plan out with the impact assessment, that will all be clear and articulated. Annabelle, any further questions?
Yes. Question from Angelos. Why did the programme not feel it was possible to keep contingency within CR22, i.e. a July go live? We feel that that's more realistic, or that's still realistic even.
I think if programme participants can go within at that pace, we will do everything to support them to go at that pace. One of the the key drivers here is having a plan that is realistic and achievable, but does have a certain level of contingency within it. And looking at the spread of all of the responses that we got back from each individual SIT cohort and how they approach that exercise, understanding some of the underpinning assumptions, and also the kind of the test points required per sprint to meet those trajectories. This is where the model that we felt most comfortable came out as. So I guess, Angelos, if yourselves and your team are able to go faster and get SIT done, as I mentioned, we'll do everything to support that and to be done quicker. But at the moment, we felt that given all of the data that we had, looking at the trends sprint on sprint and what's ahead of us, that a 5-month delay to SIT functional and migration was the most appropriate window.
Thanks, Lewis.
Should we just do hands up in the room again? So I think Gurpal, you're up.
Hi, Lewis. Thanks for this slide. In the CR, will you be sharing the set of assumptions that you've made in terms of this hockey stick approach? Because that term really makes me nervous. I think we've tried this hockey stick approach before, just a few weeks ago, and we realised and I'm just concerned that are we learning the lessons from that?
Yeah, so it's actually
not making the exact same set of sort of mistakes in terms of assumptions.
Yeah. So it probably follows more of a perhaps more of an S curve approach. But yes, we will share the assumptions that underpin the plan. We will share there's a slide actually after this that has the model and the proposed points per sprint that are needed. It's again, we factored in looking at what the current rates are, what the level of improvement sprint on sprint is across the cohorts, and try to come up with what we think is a reasonable and logical increase. So I think ideally when you see the points per sprint, they're not stratospheric in terms of numbers that they're unattainable. I think and they are challenging. They do require increased test improvement sprint on sprint, but they're not. I don't think they're at the levels that perhaps previously were being looked at when we were trying to hold M10. So we do have confidence in those targets, and we do have confidence that sprint testing will get quicker. So whilst it might not follow it might not follow the hockey stick trajectory, we do have confidence, and we can see from sprints 4, 4.1 and 4.2 specifically that a number of cohorts are getting quicker in their execution, which suggests improved system stability, addressing central party defects that might have been there in early testing. And generally, I think cohorts getting into a way of working and rhythm that suits them to progress at pace. So I think that idea of compound growth, sprint on sprint, we do think is a valid assumption, albeit I think that the level of trajectory that you might have seen in previous models in terms of required growth, we don't think, given the additional 5 months isn't as drastic as it might have been in previous models we've seen.
Okay, thank you.
Chris, you're up next.
Hi, Lewis. This is a personal question, but it's also high up the Slido list as well. Do we know when we'll get a date for the initial quad submission for SIP participants? Because that is imminent at the moment, and we've only had a kind of an informal outlook on a delay to this point.
Yeah, so we'll include all of that detail in the plan that comes out for impact assessment, because that obviously all needs to be, that is in there currently, and that all needs to be updated. So that will all be there in the plan that comes out on the 23rd with the impact assessment, or sorry, with the CR for impact assessment. I will open the floor to any of my qualification colleagues just to see if there's any guidance that they might want to give on this call. But otherwise, all of the detail will be in that detailed plan. Take that silence from the. So we'll take an action away, Chris, to clarify immediately. And I know we've got FTIG tomorrow, so I'll endeavour to get an answer for that. But it will be, the detail will be in the plan that comes out with the CR.
Okay, thanks, Lewis.
Lee, I think it's you again.
Yeah, thanks, Lewis.
Yeah.
So my mind's drifting to the change process. So we're currently under a freeze and a bit of limbo in terms of post M10 processes. Obviously, all that still needs to happen, but I'm conscious we have change mandates on hold as a consequence.
Yeah.
Is there any thinking in that space as to change that? Because I suspect that's going to build quite a bit if this gets approved.
Yeah, so at this point in time, one of the key assumptions is that the change freeze will remain in place. We're not proposing to bring any of those change requests that have been proposed for post M10 before M10. Again, this is the timeline here is based on the current scope that needs to be delivered, and adding additional scope, I think, only creates either more delay or greater risk. And I think one of the key assessments as part of the change freeze criteria is whether a change is critical to go live or fixing a testing defect. And so those defects, those changes that are scheduled for post M10 were deemed as through the program as not being critical for M10 then, and therefore kind of not critical to M10 now, essentially. So we're not proposing to bring any of those current scheduled changes for M10 forwards or into the scope of this work, because it would just create risk and it potentially extend the timelines further to when you factor in they've all got to be tested.
Yeah, and I think broadly I'd agree with that. I'm just conscious that means you may have more of a build-up, given you've got a bigger window of time for post-M10 changes.
Yeah, agreed. That is absolutely a risk and a concern.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that's been considered, if at all, but yeah, I think it's something to think about there. But okay.
Yeah, no, we recognise the risk, and we that creates, the longer the change freeze window, like you said, the more risk there is of change requests being raised that need to be deferred to after M10, and that backlog increases. We obviously want to make sure that is, that backlog is as small as possible. But I think at the moment our assumption is that any post M10 change will remain post M10.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think that is what it is at the moment. I guess I'm probably just thinking again. I'll come back to it, actually. Sorry.
Cool, no problem. Annabelle, any other questions?
Yeah, we've got quite a few more actually on Slido to get through. So will both SIT A and SIT B be upgraded to IR 8.2 in September or October 2024 maintenance window?
Correct, yes. So you'll see on this plan, we've got a 20-day window in SIT A. That's for the data loading as well, required for cycle 3 of migration and SIT functional, and a 10-day window in settlement, because the data load, there isn't the same data loading activity. So settlement testing in SIT B will recommence sooner. There is a 10-day maintenance window. the code uplift to IR 8.3. So it will commence sooner than it will back in SIT A. But yes, both environments will be uplifted to the IR 8.3 code base in September in that maintenance window.
Thank you. Question from Angelos: does the programme feel that there will be an IR 9, or is the endeavour to crystallise from IR 8.x?
Yeah, at this point, there's no IR 9 planned. Any defects that come through SIT functional and migration, well, any of the test phases after IR 8.3 would expect to be fixed as patches in testing and in the testing window. There's no intention to have any major uplift at this point to IR 9.
Thank you. And then a question from Lee: what amount of contingency has been included within the proposed plan?
Yeah, so there is a level of, this is an ambitious but realistic plan, we feel, an ambitious but realistic proposal. There is a certain level of contingency in some of these timelines, that if more time was required for particular testing phases, that could be made available. Settlement testing, obviously there is a risk around whether there is enough time in this current proposal. If more time is required in January and that requires SIT operational and non-functional to slip slightly to the right, that could happen before it impacts the critical path. Equally, the gap analysis sprint at the end of cycle 3 currently has a small set of tests to be completed, and we've aimed to kind of keep that window as free from additional testing as possible. So there is capacity in that sprint to undertake additional tests that might be needed should more time be required. And again, that wouldn't necessarily have implications on the plan. So there is manageable contingency. There's other things that we're doing around looking at the rationalization of some of the SIT functional and migration tests as well, to make sure that we're not testing the same requirement multiple times and that we're being as efficient as possible. So those kind of activities as well provide us with some contingency in this plan too. So we feel that there is room to maneuver in this proposal, and it's not a case of, right, if we miss a target in a sprint, then the whole thing's gone.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, I think Jackie's just put a hand up in the room.
Sorry, Jackie.
Yeah, hello. A quick question for me. Well, it's two-sided really. Is the programme still planning to close down over Christmas for a number of weeks? Okay. Yes. Well, with that in mind, I'm a bit concerned about the mid-August go live date. While I appreciate that, yeah, absolutely, we can put a moratorium on holidays, but it's not just holidays, people taking holidays. It's the fact that people with children, you have to cover 6 weeks when their kids are off. And a lot of the time in our department, we've got people taking time off for childcare. So they're looking after their kids. They're not swanning off to the sun, which we could, say, please book it a different time. But we can't do anything about people who need to look after their children. Wouldn't it be better to, either utilise the time over the Christmas period or make it a couple of weeks later?
I think that in itself is a difficult conundrum, Jackie. I appreciate the concern. And I totally understand that those challenges around childcare exist. What we have set out here is 11 months in the future, so we are, we feel like we're giving sufficient time. I think, truth be told, there'll be no great time. Asking people to work over the festive period in itself, when people are working, flat out in testing already, in itself is a big ask. The Christmas period is and the period around Christmas, so early December to January, is a period of time where a lot of people take annual leave anyway. And so I think asking people to work over Christmas is a difficult question in itself.
Yeah, I do understand that, but
I guess what we've done here is we've assumed that, I say the program's closed down. We've assumed that there will be, in our modelling, we haven't assumed people need to work over Christmas. if and we will explore this, if people are around and want to work in kind of the weeks leading up to Christmas and then the week immediately afterwards. So I think that's the 2nd and 3rd of January and the 23rd and 24th of December. Then we'll look to see if the program will endeavour to support that. But I think what we didn't do is assume that, and almost set a mandate that we expect people to work over the festive period at the levels and the pace that they're currently working at today. Because I think that in itself is probably asking an unrealistic expectation of many. I do appreciate the point around August, and we did look at that as a collective team. And I think the view is that we're giving sufficient time to make the right preparations. If this was something that we were perhaps putting out there with a couple of months to spare, then I think we would look at trying to do something differently. But we feel like we're giving sufficient forward notice.
Thank you.
Chris. Sorry, Carolyn. Sorry, not Chris. I saw CB and just assumed Carolyn.
CB with the other Chris. Can I just check the rationalisation that you've mentioned between functional and migration tests? When is that due to occur, Lewis? I don't want to assume it will be in the next maintenance period, but I expect that would be the optimum time to do it.
I will defer to Roger just to see if he's got a view. I know it's something we're working on at the moment. So Roger, I don't know if you have a view on the timeline for that kind of review and rationalisation activity.
Yeah, that's going on right now. We expect to have significant work on that done next week. We'll start to socialize that, get review from code bodies, get review from participants towards the back end of next week.
The intention that would be complete for the start of cycle 3, so we have the benefit of that rationalisation from the start.
Yep, that's the intention.
Lovely, thank you.
Great. I think, Annabelle, are there any more? I assume there are. We'll try and get through as many as possible. I would like to give 5 minutes. There are a number of other slides I don't necessarily need to talk to because it's underlying detail, but I would just like to point people to before we wrap up. So maybe if we've got kind of 5 more minutes for questions, and then we'll leave the last 5 just to close.
Okay, cool. I think a lot of them have also been answered anyway through other questions. So question from Anoop: does this mean that the PIT timelines for QT can also move so that QT participants get more time to complete?
Yeah, again, I think that's a safe assumption to make. We will bottom all of that out, and it will all be outlined in the detailed plan. With those PIT timelines, we'd be looking to ideally give people more time to complete their PIT. I think realistically at this stage, it doesn't necessarily make sense to ask participants to work to tighter timelines than they need to. But we will articulate these specific dates in the detailed plan that we put out next week. Sorry, in a week and a bit's time.
Thank you. A question from Lee: if SIP participants can go faster and M10 comes forwards, then will qualification dates also come forward?
It's one of the things that we'll need to bottom out if that situation arises. Yes, I mean, if I think Mr. Angelos's point, some SIP participants can go faster than this timeline. What we certainly wouldn't want to do is to hold those participants back. But obviously that does have implications on whether those supplier and agent qualification participants in wave 1 would be able to kind of come forwards as well. So it's something we would absolutely have to consider and look at and work with those wave 1 allocated parties as to see if that was something that they could do. But again, what we don't want to do is constrain anybody from going as quickly as they can. So if there was if there were a set of participants in wave 1 who were ready to go and could go sooner, and that M10 date was brought forward sooner, I think we would look to support that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of good in terms of if people can go faster, it kind of de-risks the whole plan for a lot of other people. But I think it's dangerous to assume that the whole of the qualification timescales can move forwards. Maybe it's if we do identify that SIP participants are looking as though they could bring the thing forwards, then I guess it needs the code bodies to be involved to see if they could support a an earlier kind of earlier dates for some of the qualification participants. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Lee. There's a number of elements there that we would need to consider and work through if that eventuality came around. And I think also it wouldn't necessarily be a blanket, right, we're bringing M14 forwards, for example. You know, if there are participants that are ready to go early and the programme can support, which we'd endeavour to do, and the code bodies are available to support them, yeah, we'd look to support that.
Yeah, definitely should be listed as an opportunity, shouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Proposed M10 is now on the 13th of August, which is midweek. As this involves major changes to production systems, should this not be over a weekend or at the start of the week?
Yeah, so we'll bottom the detail out in the plan. Essentially, the cutover weekend would take place the weekend beforehand, and that's articulated in the M10 M11 cutover plan, which has gone through Torwig and MCAG in recent months. So that kind of choreography of the cutover stands as it's been consulted on. That obviously the dates just changed. So the M10 date here is really the final approval by PSG to say, look, yes, M10 is everything has been done as per the cutover plan, and M10 has been M10 can now be approved effectively. So yes, the I guess the cutover activities that would need to take place would take place kind of in the run up to and over the weekend prior.
Thanks, Lewis. And then maybe just one more question from Kerry Ann. Will we have sight of all assumptions made based on the plan? Yes, absolutely. So we will issue all of that out in line with the plan, and then many of them are in this pack here as well. Okay, cool. There's still some outstanding questions on Slido, which perhaps we can answer offline. But I think for now, if you want to carry on with the deck, Michelle. That sounds good. Okay, if we could just move on then. So this slide then talks to the points per sprint and the proposed execution model that underpins the plan that you've just seen. So you can see on the right hand side table the points required per sprint, and that gradual kind of climb up to around about 2,520 points. We're in sprint 4.2, and we can see that a number of participants are well on their way to achieving upwards of 1,300. So the current kind of run rate for a number of participants is around the kind of 1,300 to 1,500 mark, which we would endeavour to kind of maintain. So we can see that in these early initial sprints that we're operating at that pace, and in some cases slightly above it. So we're confident that through the next set of sprints that these targets are attainable and can be hit. Sprint 8 might be a bit jarring in terms of 2,400 points. That is a 3-week sprint, so it assumes essentially kind of 900 points per week for the first 2 weeks, and then a Christmas slowdown in that final week, and we're running up to the week commencing the 12th. We then have obviously that first sprint after the new year again, where the level of points per week kind of increases slightly, but not anything too drastically. And then after that, we assume that teams are back up to full speed after the Christmas period, and there's a bit of a ramp up and a race to the end. And as I mentioned, you've got that gap analysis sprint in sprint 13, which is only at the moment 430 points around about there. So there is capacity in that sprint should it be required. And if we assume that participants are operating around about the 2,000 points per sprint mark, then there is capacity there should it be needed to finalise those tests in cycle 3 without causing any implications to the plan. If we just move on then to the next slide, and I'll canter through these. This one here then just shows those the milestones through to M16, basically the tier 1 milestones, and you've got the baseline date in the current plan, and then the proposed date as well. We've also added the start of migration for qualification wave 1, so that's shifted by about 5 to 6 months to at the moment the 7th of the 3rd, 2026 from the 1st of it's actually the 3rd of the 10th, 2025 in the current plan. If we just, oh sorry, Adrian, I can see you got your hand up.
Yeah, hi there. Just at the bottom there, you've got E16.
Sorry, Adrian, you're really quiet.
just because I cut my microphone out. You've said M16 2 months after M15.
Yep.
But that only looks like a month to me.
That does. We'll check that date. That might just be an error. Oh, well, that is an error. So yeah, we'll check that and and update that in the plan, or make sure it's reflected in the plan. To confirm though, that would be the 15th of May, not the 15th of April. It is a 2-month gap.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Cool. If we just keep moving on, I will quickly just point to the next set of slides. So like I said, we'll share these around imminently, but just so you've got them. So in terms of planning assumptions, we've got 2 slides here of assumptions. We've ragged each of them with a view of green being, a stable and viable assumption that we think is well tested, amber being that there's a certain level of risk in there, red being that we think it has significant risk of being incorrect. What I can say is that there's no red assumptions in here. There are some ambers that again, but there will always be a certain level of risk in the plan. So if we just move on quickly. And again. So we've highlighted some risks. This isn't an exhaustive list of risks associated with the programme. It's an associated set of risks associated with this proposed plan. So it talks about, the concerns around settlement timelines, that we need more detail around the operational, the service management designs and activities to ensure that SIT operational can be planned in time. Reservations around kind of increasing the velocity. So the type of risks that you'd expect to see. So we've captured those. As I mentioned, it's not an exhaustive list, but it captures some of the risks that we believe are associated with this plan and what we're doing to mitigate against those manifesting. And if we just move on. The next slide talks about dependencies in the plan and those key dependent activities. So if we continue cantering through, I'm conscious of time. You've seen the plan for a plan. So the only thing to call out on here is we are still tracking against it. There will be an additional set of time afterwards for the Ofgem decision, because we are outside that 3-month contingency window. So, we suspect to submit something to Ofgem in the middle of October and then give them the opportunity to make their decision. At the moment, that timeline on decision will be predicated on the quality of submission inputs. If we just keep moving on.
Sorry, just a quick one on that. Have we got an indication of the decision timescale from Ofgem?
We don't at this time. We would push to try and have a decision this year, but we will try to bottom that out with Ofgem. But when we spoke to them yesterday, they weren't in a position to commit.
Yeah, I mean, it was relatively quick, wasn't it, last time for the previous replan? So that was hopefully it's still within that kind of timescale. But I think it's important that when the new plan comes out, when the proposed plan comes out on the 23rd with the CR, we just have to use that and operate to that in the interim, because I think we did the same thing last time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This is many of you will have seen the slide, but just a view of the engagement activities. So obviously we'll be aiming to submit the change request to Change Board at the end of this week, Change Board taking place next week, and then we'll have the change webinar where we'll talk through the change request and some of the key kind of inputs that we need from you in that response as well, just to make sure it's as clear as possible. So we'll have that next Friday, and then if we just move on, I think there's one last slide I just wanted to point to and reiterate. Yeah, so 3 key takeaways here. That we need your input to gather all of the evidence that we can, and also to help ensure that this plan is as robust as possible. So we need your feedback, and that can be any feedback between now and the CR being received, and also through the IA process. So don't feel like you need to wait for the CR to be issued to IA. If you want to offer some initial feedback or thoughts, many of you have done that in the session, but please feel free to contact the PMO and we'll pick it up there. But the more feedback means the more evidence. So please do kind of feedback to us. Critical that this is not the final plan. There is an opportunity to refine it. As I mentioned, it is a proposal at this stage, so your feedback will help shape it. And we don't need to reopen the IA window. What we will do is we'll gather all of the impact and all the feedback from the IA window and that will form the recommendation to go to PSG. So you know, there is opportunity here to feedback multiple times on this to really shape it and make sure it is our collective plan. And then finally, you know, the proposed plan isn't endorsed by Ofgem, as I mentioned. I just want to stress that again. That only comes when they approve the CR. And we are working in parallel with the IPA to address any questions that they have as an assurance partner. So there's not an IPA recommendation attached to this plan yet either. And again, we'd look to address that in the future. Finally, just want to say I appreciate we have overrun, but please do get in contact with the PMO if you have any questions or comments or concerns. Like I said, we're happy to pick those up and address them outside of the impact assessment window. But otherwise, thank you all for your time. Hopefully the session was helpful and has kind of given you some clear steer or a view of you know what to expect when the impact assessment comes out.